Florida spent the last 60 years building condos, theme parks, and retirement villages on top of every square inch of coastline it could find. But somehow it missed 13 towns completely. These places didn't just fall behind, they stopped. Like someone hit pause in 1963 and forgot to press play. The buildings are the same, the signs are the same. In some cases, the people are the same. One of these towns has a post office that doubles as the world's smallest. Another has a healing spring that dried up the exact same year the town's economy did. There's a place where a 700-pound alligator is basically the mayor. And one town's entire claim to fame is that it was named after a breakfast item that two kids were fighting over during the Depression. If that sounds like your kind of real estate tour, smash that like button. This is the only channel where property values and sanity both go down. 13 Florida towns frozen in the 1960s. Let's start the countdown. Number 13, Yeehaw Junction. If you've ever driven through Central Florida on Highway 441, you've passed through Yeehaw Junction. You just didn't notice, because the whole town takes about 9 seconds to drive through at the speed limit, and maybe 4 if you're being honest about how fast you were actually going. Yeehaw Junction sits at the intersection of Highway 441 and the Florida Turnpike, surrounded by cattle ranches and absolutely nothing else. The town got its name from truckers and ranchers who used to pass through the area back when it was still open range country. Before that, locals just called it Jackass Crossing. And honestly, that name might have been more accurate. For most of the 20th century, the only reason anyone stopped here was the Desert Inn. That old roadhouse bar and restaurant sat at the crossroads since the early 1900s, serving food, drinks, and according to local legend, some services that were definitely not on the official menu. The building survived Prohibition, survived the Depression, survived multiple hurricanes, and even survived being listed on the National Register of Historic Places. What it couldn't survive was a property dispute in 2020, when the old structure was demolished. Today, Yeehaw Junction has a population of around 200 people. The intersection still exists. The cattle ranches still stretch out to the horizon, but the Desert Inn is gone, and with it, the only thing that made anyone slow down. What's left is a gas station, a few scattered houses, and the distinct feeling that you accidentally drove into someone else's memory. The Florida Department of Transportation keeps talking about widening the highway through here, but progress in Yeehaw Junction has always been more of a suggestion than a plan. Number 12, Two Egg. There's a town in the Florida Panhandle that owes its entire identity to 2 children and a poultry transaction. Two Egg, Florida sits in Jackson County near the Alabama border, and its name comes from a story during the Great Depression. Local kids would walk to the general store and trade 2 eggs for basic goods like sugar or candy. The shopkeeper started calling the area Two Egg, and somehow that stuck for almost 100 years now. Two Egg doesn't have a traffic light. It doesn't have a gas station. It doesn't have a post office, a school, or any building that could reasonably be called commercial. What it does have is a small collection of houses, a volunteer fire station, and a road sign that tourists occasionally steal because they think it's funny. The residents do not think it's funny. The population has never exceeded a few hundred people, and today it sits well below that. There's no cell service in large stretches of the area. The nearest grocery store is a 30-minute drive into Mariana. If you want to buy something in Two Egg itself, you'd better hope your neighbor is selling. The landscape around Two Egg is flat agricultural land dotted with pine trees and the occasional abandoned barn. Nothing about it screams 1960s specifically, because nothing about it screams any specific decade. It just exists quietly, the same way it has since 2 kids walked into a general store with eggs in their pockets. If you ever wanted to disappear completely while still technically living in the United States, Two Egg is your answer. Number 11, Sopchoppy. About 30 minutes south of Tallahassee, past the point where the strip malls give way to dense panhandle forest, you'll find Sopchoppy. The name comes from the Muskogee word for red oak, which tells you a lot about what you're going to see when you get there. Trees. Lots of trees. Sopchoppy has a population of around 450 people. and a downtown that looks like someone took a photograph in 1957 and then just left the photograph sitting there in the sun for 70 years. The storefronts are original. The signage is hand-painted. The speed limit drops to 25, and honestly, you don't need a sign to tell you that because there is nothing happening fast here. The town's biggest claim to fame is the annual Wormgrunton Festival. And yes, that is exactly what it sounds like. Worm grunting is a traditional technique where you drive a wooden stake into the ground and rub it with a flat piece of iron. The vibrations drive earthworms to the surface and you collect them for bait. Sop Choppy has turned this into an annual celebration with live music, food vendors, and a competition to see who can grunt the most worms out of the ground in a set amount of time. This is not a joke. This is a real event that real people attend on purpose. The festival draws visitors from across the Panhandle region and has been running for decades. For Sop Choppy, it's the economic highlight of the year. The rest of the time, life here moves at a pace that makes patients feel aggressive. If you're enjoying this countdown so far and you want to see more of America's weirdest, forgotten places, subscribing takes about 2 seconds. Faster than a worm escaping a grunt. Number 10, White Springs. White Springs sits on the banks of the Suwannee River in Hamilton County, and for a while, it was one of the most popular resort destinations in the entire southeastern United States. The town built its economy around a natural sulfur spring that locals and visitors believed had healing properties. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, people traveled from across the country to bathe in the spring water, stay in the grand hotels along the riverbank, and generally act like they discovered the fountain of youth. Stephen Foster never actually visited the Suwannee River, but he wrote a song about it anyway, and that song became the Florida state song for over 60 years. White Springs leaned into that connection hard. Building the Stephen Foster Folk Culture Center on the river's edge, the park still operates today, hosting the annual Florida Folk Festival every Memorial Day weekend. The spring itself told a different story. By the mid-20th century, the water flow had slowed dramatically. Upstream development, agricultural irrigation, and groundwater pumping gradually reduced the pressure feeding the spring, and eventually the water stopped flowing altogether. The spring house still stands on the riverbank like a monument to something that used to be there, but the pool is mostly stagnant now. The town never recovered. The grand hotels closed. The tourists stopped coming. The population dropped to around 700 and has stayed there, give or take, for decades. The buildings along the main street still have the bones of that resort-era architecture, tall windows and wide porches, but most of them are shuttered or converted into something smaller than what they were designed for. White Springs is the rare town that didn't freeze in the 60s by choice. It froze because the thing that kept it alive literally dried up. Number 9, Yankeetown. Most Florida towns were named after saints, Spanish explorers, or whatever tree was standing nearby when someone needed to fill out the paperwork. Yankeetown was named specifically to make the neighbors angry. The town sits on the Gulf Coast in Levy County, right where the Withlacoochee River meets the saltwater. It was founded in the early 1900s by A.F. Knotts, a former mayor from Gary, Indiana, who moved south and decided to name his new community after the side that won the Civil War. In a part of Florida that was still very much Confederate in its sympathies, this was not a diplomatic move. It was a deliberate provocation. Knotts apparently enjoyed the reaction. Today, Yankeetown has a population somewhere around 500 people, and the provocation has mostly worn off. What hasn't worn off is the isolation. The Fly town is accessible by a single road, County Road 40, which winds through marshland and forest before dead-ending at the Gulf. There's a boat ramp, a bait shop, a small restaurant or two, and not much else. No chain businesses, no major development. Just water, trees, and the faint historical memory of a man who moved 1,000 miles south just to start an argument. The houses in Yankeetown are a mix of old Florida cracker cottages and modest mid-century builds, many of them elevated on stilts because flooding is a regular event, not a once-in-a-lifetime situation. If the rest of Florida is a theme park, Yankeetown is what was here before anyone thought to build one. Number 8, Apalachicola. For most of the 20th century, if you ate an oyster in Florida, there was a 90% chance it came from Apalachicola Bay. That's not an exaggeration. The town of Apalachicola, sitting on the Panhandle's forgotten coast, was the oyster capital of the state and one of the most productive shellfish harvesting regions in the entire country. The downtown waterfront is lined with Victorian-era commercial buildings, most of them built during the town's peak as the third largest port on the Gulf of Mexico. The John Gorey Museum sits here too, honoring the local doctor who invented an early form of mechanical refrigeration in 1851. Apalachicola has been punching above its weight historically for a long time. Then the water wars started. Georgia and Alabama began diverting more and more water from the Apalachicola-Chattahoochee-Flint River system for agricultural irrigation and municipal supply. Less fresh water reaching the bay meant higher salinity. Higher salinity meant fewer oysters. By the 2010s, the oyster harvest had collapsed so severely that the state temporarily banned harvesting altogether to let the population recover. Oystermen who'd worked the bay their entire lives suddenly had nothing to do and nowhere to go. The town's population today sits around 2,500. The Victorian buildings are still beautiful, still standing, still mostly occupied by small businesses and a handful of restaurants that serve locally caught seafood when they can get it. Apalachicola isn't abandoned. It's more like a museum that people still happen to live in. The architecture is preserved because there was never enough money to tear it down and build something new. The irony is that this accidental preservation is now the town's biggest selling point. Tourists come specifically because it looks like this, which is the most Florida thing imaginable. Neglect something long enough, and eventually someone calls it charming. Number 7, Casadaga. About 35 miles north of Orlando, past the outlet malls and the gated subdivisions and the endless parade of gas stations shaped like things that aren't gas stations, you'll find a town where the dead are just another part of the real estate transaction. Casadaga is a spiritualist community founded in 1894 by George Colby, a medium from New York who claimed that a Native American spirit guide named Seneca led him to this specific patch of Florida swampland. Colby established the community as a winter gathering place for spiritualists, and it has operated continuously as exactly that for over 130 years. The town is technically a census-designated place with a population under 100 permanent residents, and most of those residents are certified mediums and healers. This isn't a tourist gimmick. The Southern Casadaga Spiritualist Camp Meeting Association is a chartered religious organization, and the community operates under a set of bylaws that have been in place since the 19th century. To live inside the camp, you need to be a registered medium or healer, or be directly affiliated with one. The Casadaga Hotel still operates on the main road, looking exactly like it did in the middle of the 20th century. Wood-paneled, slightly creaky, and allegedly haunted by several permanent spiritual residents who check in but never check out. The bookstore sells tarot decks, healing crystals, and books on communicating with the deceased. Readings are available by appointment or walk-in, and the price list is posted outside like a diner menu. What makes Casadaga genuinely fascinating is that it's not a theme. There's no ironic distance here. The residents believe completely, the community functions around that belief, and the architecture reflects the era when that belief system was at its peak. The buildings haven't been updated because the people inside them don't see a reason to update them. The spiritual world doesn't care about modern fixtures. Number 6, Everglades City. Now we're getting into the part of the list where things take a darker turn. Everglades City sits on the western edge of the Everglades, at the end of a long road that leads to absolutely nothing except swamp, water, and a town of about 400 people who chose to live surrounded by both. This was the original seat of Collier County before the government moved it to East Naples, which tells you everything about how the priorities shifted. The town's mid-century heyday revolved around fishing, crabbing, and being the last outpost of civilization before the 10,000 Islands. Rod and Gun Club, a historic lodge on the Barren River, hosted presidents and celebrities who came to fish the backcountry. Old wood-frame buildings lined the small downtown, and life moved at the same speed as the river, which is to say, barely. Then the marijuana trade arrived. In the late 1970s and early 80s, Everglades City became one of the most active marijuana smuggling hubs in the United States. The swamp provided perfect cover. The maze of waterways and islands made enforcement nearly impossible. Local fishermen, already struggling economically, discovered that a single night of running bales could earn more than a year of honest crabbing. In 1983, the DEA launched Operation Everglades. Over 200 people were arrested in a series of raids that swept through the town and surrounding areas. According to reports at the time, nearly every adult male in Everglades City was either arrested or implicated. The operation essentially gutted the town's population overnight. The aftermath left Everglades City hollowed out and suspicious of outsiders in a way that persists today. The town rebuilt slowly around ecotourism and sport fishing, but the scars from that era are still visible in the guarded expressions and the stories that locals will tell you only if they decide they trust you first. The buildings are still the same, the docks are still the same, the swamp is definitely still the same. Everglades City didn't freeze in the 60s. It froze in 1983, the night the helicopters came. If this is the kind of content you look forward to, tapping that subscribe button means you'll never miss one of these deep dives. We do this every single week. Number 5, Cedar Key. Cedar Key is a cluster of small islands off the Gulf Coast in Levy County, about 3 hours north of Tampa, and it might be the single best example of a Florida town that peaked, collapsed, and then just decided to stay collapsed. In the 1880s, Cedar Key was a booming industrial town. The Eberhard Faber Pencil Company had a major operation here, harvesting the native cedar trees that grew thick on the islands and milling them into pencils. The railroad connected the town to the mainland, money was flowing, and Cedar Key was one of the most important ports on the Gulf. Then a hurricane hit in 1896. It destroyed much of the town, and the cedar trees, which had been aggressively overharvested for years, were largely gone. The pencil factory moved its operations elsewhere. The railroad pulled out. Cedar Key lost its industry, its infrastructure, and most of its population in the span of a few years. What's remarkable is what happened next, which is essentially nothing. Cedar Key never rebuilt into anything bigger than what it is now. A small fishing village with a population of around 700 people, one main road in, no traffic lights, no chain restaurants, and a downtown that looks like someone decorated it in 1962 and then went to lunch and never came back. The seafood restaurants serve clam chowder and grouper sandwiches. The docks are lined with working fishing boats. The general store sells bait and sunscreen in equal measure. There's a quietness to Cedar Key that feels intentional. The island rejected a proposal for a bridge expansion in the 1980s because residents didn't want more traffic. That single decision basically guaranteed the town would stay small, stay slow, and stay exactly like this forever. And the people who live there seem perfectly fine with that arrangement. Number 4, Mechanipe. If you've ever seen the 1991 movie Doc Hollywood, where Michael J. Fox plays a doctor whose car breaks down in a tiny southern town and ends up falling in love with the place, that town is Mechanipe. They filmed it right here on Chulaka Boulevard, which is the main street, and also the only street that matters. Mechanipe holds the title of oldest inland town in Florida, established in 1821. The Seminole chief Mechanipe, for whom the town is named, led resistance against American expansion in the area during the Second Seminole War. The town that carries his name outlasted the conflict but never grew much beyond its original footprint. Today, Mechanipe has a population of roughly 600 people and an economy built almost entirely on antique shops. Chulaka Boulevard is lined with old wooden and brick buildings. Most of them converted into antique stores use bookshops and the occasional cafe. The architecture dates to the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it's all original. Not restored, not rebuilt. Just old and still standing because nobody tore it down. The town has no fast food, no big box retail, no modern development of any kind visible from the main road. The moss hangs thick from the oak trees, the speed limit is barely above walking pace, and the loudest sound on a Tuesday afternoon is usually a screen door closing. Mechanipe doesn't feel frozen in the 60s. It feels frozen in the 1890s, with a thin layer of mid-century dust on top. Visitors usually come for the antiques, stay for an hour, and leave with a rocking chair strapped to the roof of their car and a vague sense that they just time traveled. Residents are used to this. They wave from the porches and go back to whatever they were doing, which in Mechanipe is usually not much. Number 3, Ochapi. Ochapi is home to the smallest post office in the United States, and when they say smallest, they mean it in the most literal way possible. The building is a single shed roughly 7 feet by 8 feet, sitting on the shoulder of the Tamiami Trail in Collier County. It started life as an irrigation pipe storage shed for a tomato farm. When the original Ochapi post office burned down in 1953, the postmaster needed somewhere to work immediately, so they moved operations into the shed. The plan was to build a proper replacement. That plan never materialized, and 70-plus years later, the shed is still the post office. Inside, there's barely enough room for one postal worker and a small counter. There is no lobby. There is no parking lot. Customers walk up to a small window on the side of the building, conduct their business, and leave. The American flag out front is the largest thing on the property. Tourists stop constantly to take photographs, which means the postal worker spends roughly equal time processing mail and posing for pictures they didn't agree to be in. Ochapi itself is not really a town in any traditional sense. It's a scattering of structures along the highway that runs through the Everglades between Naples and Miami. The Big Cypress National Preserve surrounds it on all sides. The population is somewhere in the low hundreds, though counting is difficult because living in Ochapi and living near Ochapi in the swamp are two categories that overlap without clear boundaries. The Tamiami Trail cuts through the Everglades like a scar, flat and straight and endless, with swamp on both sides and the occasional airboat rental shack breaking the monotony. Ochapi's post office is the most photographed thing on the entire 100-mile stretch. A shed that was supposed to be temporary in 1953 is now a permanent landmark. If that's not Florida in a nutshell, nothing is. Number 2, Carabel. Carabel sits on the Panhandle coast in Franklin County, and for decades it was home to what locals proudly called the world's smallest police station. That station was a phone booth. The story goes that Carabel's police department used to operate out of a regular call box on Highway 98. Officers would receive their dispatches through the phone, and the booth essentially functioned as headquarters. The problem was that locals kept using it to make personal long-distance calls, so the department eventually had to put a lock on it. A police station that requires a lock to keep civilians out is, by any reasonable standard, the most Florida law enforcement story ever told. The original phone booth was replaced in 2000 with a slightly larger structure, but the old booth is preserved as a historical landmark and tourist attraction, sitting right on the main road. People pull over, take a photo, stare at it for a moment, and then look around for the rest of the town. There isn't much else to find. Carabel has a population of around 2,700 people, a working waterfront, and the kind of quiet that makes you check your phone to see if you still have signal. The fishing boats go out in the morning, come back in the afternoon, and the day's rhythm is dictated entirely by the tide. The buildings along Marine Street date to the mid-20th century and earlier, with painted cinder block and corrugated metal roofing being the dominant architectural style. Camp Gordon Johnston, a World War II amphibious training base, operated nearby, and the local museum preserves that history with the kind of devotion that only a town with very little else going on can sustain. The Panhandle's Forgotten Coast earned that nickname for a reason. Carabel is proof that some places don't get left behind by accident. They get left behind because the highway went somewhere else, the money followed, and nobody came back to check. Number 1, Weeki Wachee. And finally, the town that might be the single strangest relic of mid-century Florida still in operation. Weeki Wachee Springs was opened in 1947 by a former Navy frogman named Newton Perry, who had figured out a technique for breathing underwater using submerged air hoses. His big idea was to train young women to perform choreographed underwater shows in the crystal-clear spring while breathing through those hoses. Essentially professional mermaids. It was, by every rational standard, an absurd business plan, and it worked spectacularly. By the 1960s, Weeki Wachee was one of the most popular roadside attractions in America. Families drove from across the country to watch women in mermaid tails perform synchronized swimming routines in water so clear you could see 60 feet to the bottom. The spring itself is one of the deepest freshwater cave systems in the United States, pumping out more than 100 million gallons of water per day. Elvis Presley visited. So did Don Knotts. The mermaids performed in an underwater theater with glass viewing windows, and audiences packed the seats daily. Then Interstate 75 was built. The new highway bypassed Weeki Wachee entirely, routing tourist traffic directly to Tampa and Orlando instead of along the old coastal roads. Attendance plummeted. The attraction cycled through different owners, each trying to modernize it or squeeze more profit from it, and each one failing. By the 2000s, Weeki Wachee was on the verge of shutting down permanently. That's when the state of Florida stepped in and did something almost unprecedented. They turned Weeki Wachee into a state park, not to preserve the spring, though the spring is ecologically valuable. They did it specifically to preserve the mermaid show. Today, the mermaids still perform. The underwater theater still has its glass windows. The air hoses still work the same way Newton Perry designed them in 1947. The women who perform are athletes and artists who train for months before they are allowed to do a show, holding poses, performing choreography, and smiling underwater, all while breathing through a tube that would terrify most people in a swimming pool. The whole thing looks exactly like it did in 1960. The costumes, the theater, the turquoise spring water, the audiences pressing their faces to the glass. In a state that has torn down, paved over, and rebuilt itself a dozen times since the Kennedy administration, the mermaids are still here, doing the same show in the same water, in the same building. Because sometimes the weirdest idea in the room is also the one that survives. That's the list. 13 Florida towns that the 21st century either forgot about or chose to ignore. If you made it to the end, you're officially one of us. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we find places like this every single week. And if you know a town that belongs on this list, drop it in the comments. We'll see you in the next one.